Hello, I'm Peter Deegan, a member of the RSSL QP training faculty, and welcome to the next podcast in our series of My QP Journey. These interviews are aimed at talking with previous RSSL QP training alumni with the aim of paying forward their experiences to prospective trainee QPs. Travelling down the QP training journey requires dedication, tenacity, curiosity, and of course a passion for our true customers, our patients. Of course, the first undertaking of anyone wishing to take such a journey is to learn from those who have already trodden that path, so that we may gain from their insight, wisdom, know the best shortcuts, and avoid those obvious potholes. It's therefore my pleasure to welcome Rebeca Bruzzichessi, who's recently completed the QP training journey with RSSL and successfully passed their QP viva. Welcome, Rebeca, and very importantly, many congratulations on your huge achievement. Welcome to the QP community.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
My pleasure. It would be good, firstly, Rebeca, if you could share your background professionally and academically.
So I have started in the pharmaceutical industry back in 2011 as packaging technician on a temporary contract. And after I was in the role for 2 weeks, someone noticed in my CV within that company that I had chemistry A levels. And then I was offered a role within the QC laboratories as a technician. And as part of that role, they also offered to pay for my degree in chemistry within the Open University. So I managed to complete the degree within 4 years. And in that time, I progressed into a stability team leader role. And then when I finished my degree, I progressed into a QA team leader role. And then I was looking after QMS for a couple of years. After that, within the same company, I was promoted into a QA professional where I was looking after third-party CMOs that were manufacturing products for the MAH. And then a few years later, I got promoted into a QA manager within a different site, but within the same company. After a year working within that site, I moved on into another company, which is where I am now, as a head of quality compliance and validation. And I have been in this role for the past 4 years and is where I completed my QP training.
So with your degree from the Open University, did the Royal Society of Chemistry just accept you without any question to be a member?
Yes. So when I finished my degree, I was able to even during my degree, you were able to register within the Royal Society, but then when you finish, they accept you as a member, so no questions asked or anything.
So first check on the eligibility box there.
Yes.
Great. Well, I'm going to walk now through the requirements and to walk through the natural sequence of the QP journey, Rebeca, if that's okay. First, understanding the requirements. So that's the guidance notes to know what's a QP and how do you get there. Second, the knowledge and experience requirements. So that's the study guide with the 3 core foundation modules and the other modules, and then the practical requirements. And finally, putting it all together in the application form. So that's the sort of journey I want to go on today. So let's talk about eligibility to start with. You've got a degree in chemistry. You're a member of the Royal Society of Chemistry, so that's a checkbox. But the guidance notes are quite detailed. How did you first find out about the QP role and what attracted you to want to be one?
So I originally found out about a QP role when I was working in the labs. And obviously being in the pharmaceutical industry, you hear about audits, you hear about certification of batches, and that's when the whole world of a QP got introduced to myself. At that point, I wanted to be a MHRA inspector because I was always really fascinated with the inspection process. I had always been involved in back rooms. When I moved into QA, I was scribing in the front room. So for me, that was so fascinating, the whole audit experience. But then as I grew within my career and my understanding of the pharmaceutical industry, the role of the QP really grew on me in the sense that they are personally responsible for patient safety, also for representing that company and for representing the MHRA in the sense of towards the other departments in the company. You are kind of that person helping people, enabling people to make sure they are completing their jobs in an appropriate manner. And for me, it was a natural progression in the sense that as I progressed within my roles, but also I always felt that what a privilege would be to have this responsibility. It can be difficult at times, but it felt to me that would be a privilege to be able to have patient safety at the forefront in terms of actually having to sign for batches.
I think that's my experience as well, Rebecca. When I first heard of the role of the QP, all of a sudden the QA manager just signed a few documents for me, and I'm thinking, what's that about? And all of a sudden the batch went on the truck. And as you did, I started to understand the true value of the role and that patient advocate. And I like what you talk about as well, the MHRA, the inspection advocate, the government advocate as well. As a QP, you have to protect the business as well as the patient. And I think that's a very laudable approach. But it must have been daunting. All of a sudden, then you pick up the guidance notes and the joint study guide. How did you start the analysis of what's required versus your experience and your knowledge requirements? How did you break it down into manageable segments?
So for me, the first module I ever went on within RSSL, this is even before I had definitely decided that I wanted to go through the full process, was the QP roles and duties.
Right.
Because my boss at the time, she said to me, I think you should go on that course because it's going to be good for your understanding of your current role, but at the same time, will give you an idea of what the QP does on a day-to-day basis. So after being in that course, I was terrified, I must be honest. I just thought, oh my goodness, it's so much responsibility. The process is really long, but within RSSL, they bring someone from the Royal Society of Chemistry to give us a talk, which I thought was really interesting. And then also they go through a mock viva live. So it gave me a very good insight of what I was going to be signing up for. And I got some very good advices in the sense that for every time I would complete a module, I would make sure I would do a gap analysis of any gaps I had in my curriculum. And I think it was in this module that they told us, make sure that every time you complete a module, you're doing that gap analysis. If you need to do any visits, if you need to gain more experience in a certain aspect of the study guide, make sure you go and do there and then. And I really appreciate having that advice as my first module and like first kind of practical advice, because I took that on then throughout. And then I would make sure that, for example, if I did an API module, soon after I was going into API sites, if there was opportunity for audits, even to just observe, I would make sure I would go and observe. Or if I did a formulation module and there was a dosage form that I wasn't familiar, that I would try and arrange to go and visit a site that would manufacture that kind of dosage form and vice versa. So I was just doing that as I went along with the process of training.
That's really good. And I'm going to talk about the practical experience journey in a second. But one of the challenges that a trainee QP has, it depends upon the size of the organization that you're working with, what the formulation diversity is. Some people may well work for small companies. It may be a virtual company that may have a specialist role, maybe an IMP, maybe medicinal gases, for example, very niche products maybe. How did you start to establish a QP network to help you on this journey?
So LinkedIn was very useful because I was just connecting with different people. But then also being on the modules meant that I met people that would be either slightly ahead, slightly behind me on training, or actually around the same speed as me, like at the same time. So that's how I started to create my network. I also had a couple of colleagues in work that were going through the training at the same time as me, or maybe slightly ahead. But that also helped because if they had a study group that I could join, I would make sure I would join. Also, the RSSL has a group chat on WhatsApp that we are able to chat to each other, ask questions, any doubts. So that also helped creating that network.
So what you're saying is that you actually had peer colleagues within your own company with whom you could network initially, plus the peers on the actual training courses themselves. Everybody sort of collaborates together to try and help each other out.
Yes, and it's funny because the pharmaceutical industry, although it seems massive, is quite small, because in these courses I would see people that have worked in the past and I hadn't seen them in a few years, or meet up old colleagues, and then just it's interesting how much you meet people again.
And I think one of the great skills that you need as a trainee QP is not be shy to pick up the phone, to send that email, to do that LinkedIn and just say, hey, look, can you help out?
Yeah, that's true.
So I want to go through the practical qualifying experience. I'm looking now at the guidance notes.
Mhm.
I want to talk about section 2.2 of the study guidance notes of practical qualifying experience. Let's quote what it says. The applicant is expected to be able to demonstrate the application of this knowledge through experience of at least 2 years or 1 year if you're a pharmacist. Indeed, the feedback from assessors is also that many first written applications get rejected because the candidate hasn't met the breadth expected. So, when you started on your QP journey, where were you on the experience meter, and how did you look at the gaps and A, identify what experience you actually need, and B, how did you get that experience?
When I started, I was a QA manager working in liquids manufacturing only, and I did 2 modules, and then I had a break of about a year because of COVID, moving companies and all that. Then when I started in a new company, I was a lot less hands-on on a day-to-day work than I had been previously. So as a consequence of that, I felt that instead of improving my experience, it kind of dropped back, because what you will find within the scenarios or even writing your application form is that practical experience of actually dealing with issues on a day-to-day basis. So I went from reviewing and approving every single investigation in one site to then just have a role of supporting a big team doing the doing, and I was just there as a support, as giving advice. So what I had to do was to step out of that role for a while and actually be hands-on on the day-to-day issues that were happening in my workplace. So I was very fortunate to be in a site where we made several different types of dosage forms, so oral solid dose, liquids, semi-solids, but I had then to volunteer to lead investigations on site. I had to make sure I was communicating with my boss so that she was aware that when there is, for example, a micro issue, I need to be involved. When there is formulation issue, I need to be involved so that I could regain that experience I already had, but kind of lost practice. I also spent time in different departments within quality just to make sure I was reviewing batch records, reviewing documentation for regulatory submissions. I know the study guide doesn't talk directly about regulatory submissions, but when you do a regulatory submission, you look at everything for that product, like from beginning to end, from development all the way into process validation. So I spent 6 months seconded in that department just so I could have the practical knowledge of dealing with issues associated with those. I also went to spend times in the labs because I had worked in the labs in the past, but 10 years ago, if you know what I'm saying. So my practical knowledge of analytical tests and things had kind of dropped a bit. So I had to go and spend a week, for example, in micro. I went a few times into the chemical laboratory as well. If I had a question to understand the new methodologies, for example, when I used to work in the labs, we only had HPLCs, but now we have UHPLCs. So just to understand the differences. So that's how I went on about my practical gaps.
I want to discuss your time in regulatory first, and then I want to explore your approach that you took in that experience gathering. I've worked in regulatory, and it is a different world completely. And the role of the QP is to certify that the batch as manufactured meets the requirements of the marketing authorization. And yet, very few QPs understand the regulatory process, notice to applicants for submission and the approval process, and even the common technical dossier format and structure, because that is worth its weight in gold. When you start to have a problem, when you start to get issues, or when you have major changes, going back to the original marketing authorization, understanding where that information is held, who created it, who are the owners. Some could be clinically owned, some may well be CMC owned, others may well be legally owned. And it's a really important factor. And I was a complete advocate and really changed my way of thinking as a QP by working in regulatory for a while.
Yeah, it definitely really broadened my view of that specific legal duty of the QP, because there's so many instances as well that, for example, people might think a change does not have an impact on the module 3, but actually does. And having that knowledge to be able to go back and forth and understand what the history of the product, isn't it?
And it's usually the technical experts that are advocating which level of variation it is. But as a QP, you need to have that right or that veto or that assurance that it is the right level of variation, because you might have to pick up the phone and talk to the licensing authority
Exactly.
in advance of that rather than just put the paperwork in, because it comes back to patient safety, efficacy and quality at the end of the day. So I think that's fantastic that you've got regulatory experience, and I would highly advocate anybody listening in to work with regulatory affairs for a while if you can as part of your QP training. Don't just learn the different formulations and visit the factories, visit the regulatory departments, understand how a submission is pulled together and how a submission is authorized and how it is managed. And again, many delegates for the QP training course may well work for international major pharma companies. Okay. Do you know how you get a license in each country? Do you know what the pharmaceutical affiliate is doing and how they get information and how they talk to their authority and what approval means? Because approval may not actually be there. It may be no negative response. It may well be they don't have a competent authority in that particular country or region, and therefore they're waiting on first country approval, which could be a US license or a European license or a UK license. It's those surrogate points that as a QP you really need to understand.
Yes, for sure.
The second point I want to make is I really admire your approach. You've taken a very personal, proactive learning journey there. How easy, therefore, was it to create your own path and go to your management and say, look, okay, I'm in a full-time equivalent to do this role, but I want 10 hours a month, etc., to do something different and do extra work? Because it's easy to get approved to go out for a week's course and come back. But how difficult was it to get your management's endorsement approval to spend extra work time away from your day job to do the extra training bits and extra learning bits?
So my manager, she was very supportive throughout the whole process, but I must say it was not easy. I still had to commit to do extra hours sometimes. I had to sometimes pick up my own work and say I'll do this as a side. And also, I think for me, being a manager myself, I had to be very open and honest with my team to basically tell them, look, this week I'm not going to be able to be as supportive as I usually am because I need to be focusing on something else. But if you need me, I am here. I might be taking a little bit longer to reply and things like that. And I think being open and honest with your team and with your manager, it did make a big difference. Everyone knew what I was trying to achieve. And I felt that they were all very supportive, but I did have to put on a lot of extra hours myself as well, just to make sure nothing would fall to the side.
Was your line manager your QP sponsor?
No. So my line manager is the quality director. She's also a QP, But between her and the lead QP, because as I mentioned before, I had some colleagues in the same process, they divided the group, and the lead QP for the site was my sponsor.
So, for those listening who may be just starting their journey, what is the role of the sponsor, Rebecca, and how critical are they in supporting your QP training journey?
So the sponsor is there not just to sign your application form and your certificate. They are there to help you towards achieving this goal of becoming a QP. So they can help you towards any gaps that you may have. So it could be gaps of knowledge. So my sponsor, lots of times I would go and sit with him for full days in his office, just so I could listen to discussions taking place on a day-to-day basis, but at the same time to ask questions related to subjects that I could be struggling with, to learn the theory and also the practical side and how to apply that on my day-to-day. So he was there to support me. He's also there to support you in terms of any gaps. So he might have contacts of people that you could go and visit to close these gaps. Also asking you mock viva questions. You might have an arrangement where once a month or once a week, depending on their disponibility, they are there to support you. But it's very critical because with no support, I think is almost impossible. So they are there just to facilitate the whole process. And even now that I have passed, my sponsor is still there for me now that I am learning to do this on a day-to-day. Because now is when the hard work actually starts. But they're still there as a more experienced QP that has been through several issues in the past to make sure you are supported throughout your process of certifying batches.
So it sounds like you've got a very proactive line manager who's also a QP and understands what journey you're on, and also the sponsor is being very proactive with you. What advice would you therefore give to others about choosing a sponsor, approaching a sponsor for the first time, engaging with the right sponsor? Sometimes it can be quite daunting because they are in essence a senior role and I'm just starting on my journey and I don't even know where to start asking.
I think in terms of choosing a sponsor or approaching someone, it's always good to have the conversation of like, I'm going to need your support and how much time are you willing to give me in terms of supporting. Also, I think it's good to look for QPs that have already some experience, that have already been doing the job for a while, because they will have the insights of the ins and outs of what goes on the day to day. And then I think it's always good to have a structured approach. So whoever you choose and you pick to be your sponsor, it's always good to have that fixed calendar appointment, so it's always happening. Try not to cancel it or try not to replace it with something else. But as well as having a good sponsor, I made sure I was asking different people for support as well, so don't just rely on your sponsor. So I had, for example, a friend that passed a year before me, and I made sure we kept connected. And after I got a date and I was getting close to my viva, we would meet regularly for her to ask me questions and to keep me up to date. Sometimes having someone that has just recently gone through the process is really helpful too, because they have just gone through it. So they have the questions fresh in their minds. They have all the scenarios like ready because they've just been revising. So I used that quite a lot myself to make sure I was having all the support I felt I needed at that time. But my sponsor very supportive at showing me batch records, opening up about issues. So you just make sure you have an open conversation with that person to say, look, I'm going to need as much support as I can, but be proactive as well to ask for other help. Because one of the things I found is the more used you get to talking about answering questions to different people, the better. Because on the day you're going to be talking to 3 people that you've never seen before in your life. So the more use you get to talk to strangers about the study guide topics, the better.
What a great way of putting it. I was going to say, we all focus on the joint study guide and the technical requirements and the technical skills. There are leadership, there are interpersonal, there are high-end communication skills, influencing skills, directive skills. And it's not just about the actual QP job, it's about ensuring that you can achieve your own focus. What's jumping out to me, again, and for anybody listening in, is you really owned this yourself. You really weren't pushed by somebody. You pulled everybody in. And I think that's really clear as to a success factor.
Yeah. In the whole journey, you have to be very proactive because the QP study process can take a long time. And I must say, you get peaks of motivation and lower peaks as well for demotivation. So it's an up and down journey. It's not constant. So you do need to be very proactive towards what you need in terms of closing your gaps.
I liked also what you said about holding them to task, is that diary time that can't be moved, that shouldn't be moved. I can only assume that the root cause to your success was that you almost contracted with them, and it's not necessarily on a process contract. It's almost like on an emotional, transactional level, where we're doing this for the benefit of both you, me, and our patients. And it's really important to keep together on this. I also liked what you said about you also had a good network with a colleague or colleagues who were going through the same process. And once again, it's that tenacity, that influencing skills to be brave to pick up the phone, pick up the WhatsApp, pick up the email and just say, can you help me? Because invariably, those who have gone through the same process will.
Mhm.
I want to move now on to the study guide itself. There are some very clear knowledge requirements that a QP has to undertake. Did you take all the modules, or did you get exemption for some modules because of previous experience?
I chose to take all the modules in the end, yes.
So it sounds like you might have had some experience in some of the modules. Why then did you just choose to take all the modules and not have a faster route?
For me, I wanted to make sure I was covering every aspect of the study guide because although I had extensive experience on the PQS, for example, because I have been for years worked in QMS, I just wanted to make sure that I knew all the points within the study guide and I was interpreting them well. I think the RSSL courses, they're very good in the sense that each module, if you look at the format of the presentations, it is actually each of the items of the study guide. So for that reason, I thought, no, it's best to just take a longer route, but making sure I am focusing on the right things and the right aspects of each of those modules. So yes, so that was my reasoning.
I think what's really important to remember is that as professionals, you need to maintain continuing professional development. And going through all the modules is, I suppose, the ultimate way to do that. But it does keep you current. And that's one of the requirements of the study guide and the guidance, is that you are required to be able to demonstrate current knowledge of the pharmaceutical quality system or whichever module you're training on. So I think it's important. It is a valued judgment as an individual to be able to make that assessment, but you have to make that with your sponsor as well, because it will jump out on the application form if there are any knowledge gaps explicitly, because if you've chosen not to do the theory, the assessor will jump in and go, right, I need to be able to assess whether they are maintaining current knowledge or not.
Mm. Yes.
So the first three modules in the joint study guide are bundled together essentially, and they're the foundation knowledge requirements of law and admin, role and professional duties, and pharmaceutical quality system. How did you approach your learning on these modules? And by that, what I mean is, how did you keep these three interconnected at the top throughout your learning journey for those modules?
What I've done is I use the pharmaceutical law as the basis of my study because it's basically the beginning, the foundation. They are called foundation topics for a reason. And the QP roles and duties. So those two, I had notes on my walls everywhere. I because whatever I was doing, I'm making sure I was applying them. The PQS, it came to me more naturally because it's what I do day in and day out on my day-to-day job. But a good activity that I did at the very start of my revision process was to pick a product in my site and apply each of those three modules into that product. So, for example, the applying all the laws for the introduction of the raw materials that will go into that product, then the analytical testing, then the manufacturing of the finished product, then the release testing, etc., etc. And that was very useful for me as an activity, and including dividing the QP roles and duties to where does it sit in the beginning to end of the manufacturing and release process of that product. And then afterwards, including where the PQS would apply in terms of when do you need to raise a change control, when do you need a deviation, what KPIs do you need to take out of this manufacturing process, etc., etc. And I think that was what opened my mind to see how each of the modules apply to everything, but I think at the beginning it's very difficult to have that understanding. You think about law and you think about memorizing numbers, but it's not just that, isn't it? It's applicable to each step of that manufacturing process.
It comes back to what we were talking about, the regulatory experience, particularly under law and admin. There are some rules. The chances are you as the QP will know all the directives required. Regulatory won't know them. They'll know the change management process. They'll know the documents. They'll know the structure. They will be the guardians of the data that you need to be able to assess that change or that variation. So it is that interconnectedness. I really like the way you say that. Pharmaceutical quality system is very structured. In some ways, you're just walking through the 9 chapters of EU GMP, but you're not. It is understanding that core knowledge requirement. But when you've got a complaint, is that an adverse event signal? When you've got a complaint, is that a potential recall? Post the recall or post the major quality incident, what changes? What's the quality improvement? It all feeds back and it all feeds round itself. Because as an assessor, one tries to look past the words on the application form and evaluate whether the applicant really has had the past experience to the necessary minimum level. And that interconnectedness jumps out during the application form, during the interview, to see, is this person joining up the dots? Or are they just down a singular track of a theoretical module? So your application form, how it's joined up in its thinking across those boundaries, particularly with regards to the 3 core modules, really should jump out to the assessor that you've got an holistic view here. So how were you able to demonstrate that you were building up a case for the application form, that you're getting it holistically, that this is the top of the pyramid for the patient? Because to my mind, that's what you need to make your application form jump out to the assessor, for them to actually feel that you've been in that situation and you've done it. Even though you may not have too much experience, you're trying to fill an application form to the best of your ability. How did you make it stand out that your thought processes were joined up?
I think it was about using as many examples of my day-to-day work as possible. So when I made sure I used several examples of actual deviations that I had worked on, change controls, I try and kept it as less theoretical as possible. So whenever I would address a point within the study guide, I would make sure I was using my practical experience of that topic, and always referring back to the legislation associated with whatever I was talking about, always referring back to, as a QP, this is what I looked for in terms of my routine duties, in terms of my legal duties, and then always ensuring as well that everything has been documented in the PQS. So this is the approach I took.
I think that's really useful because the guidance notes already tell you put what you actually did rather than what you would do, because it's got to jump out that you have done that. And the assessors will really want to explore that in the interview. Okay, I've got some words here. They sound credible. They sound very solid. I want to ask a scenario to be able to demonstrate that the words on the application form are written by the individual in front of me, and the individual in front of me really did that. And it sounds rather obvious to say that, but that's really what the assessor's trying to do. The assessor is not trying to catch you out. They're trying to be able to evaluate in that 1.5, 2 hour period, has that person got the necessary level of experience to be able to be a QP tomorrow? Are they already operating as a QP in that regard? So you said that you did all the modules, which, in addition to the 3 foundation modules, which of the other modules did you, with hindsight and on reflection, find were the most beneficial to you, and why?
I would say the formulation modules, the 2 part 1 and part 2 formulation, because I have never had a practical experience in manufacturing myself. So although I did spend a lot of time in production during my training process, I found that the theory behind those modules were something new to me in terms of my previous experience. I also really enjoyed the MedChem module. Although I had studied some aspects of MedChem in university, I found it quite enjoyable to review some of those points, like refresh myself, but at the same time, linking everything to the patient safety and how medicines impact patients in general. I find that really fascinating. And another module that was extremely helpful for me was micro, not coming from a biological background myself. I always worked with chemical formulations. So the microbiology module was extremely useful for me. I think I'll put as my top 3 were those 3 modules, but every single module was extremely helpful.
That's really interesting. It's very similar to my personal experience, particularly about micro. I don't have any biological qualifications, and when I moved to ICI, which is now AstraZeneca, to Macclesfield back in the 90s, I was dragged kicking onto the sterile plants as part of my QP training. I didn't have a clue, and I always consider myself probably to be more of a microbiologist now than a chemist, having worked all that time in steriles. But it really does apply very strongly, and it brings that knowledge to the forefront of, I kind of get it now. Likewise with formulation. These modules are not teaching you about formulation. They're teaching you about, now that you're a QP, what are the important parts of formulation which may impact upon your capability for batch certification, for safety, efficacy, and quality. So it's fundamental. And I also used to work on site with the R&D teams. I would always even take lunch with our pharmacovigilance medic or our study medic, because you truly understand the real patient advocate and that medically qualified person who is there with the bedside manner to the patient to ensure that that patient is the first and foremost person of thought in the whole of the study. That really excited me, and also exploring the actual science and the medicinal chemistry behind it was just fascinating and very motivating to me personally as well. So once you'd gone through one of the modules, whether you'd had a large learning curve or a short learning curve, how did you approach post-course practical information of that theory that you've gained? The reason why I asked is that it's easy the week after the course to get sucked back into the daily routine of your work and life and maybe family. So it's that refractory period where you've got to really consolidate your learning. And I'm coming back to the ability then to start filling that application form straight away, to be able to demonstrate, articulate, codify your experience over the theory. How did you approach that?
So what I did, it was after I finished each module, I would then write up my own summary notes for that specific module, just so I had something small, easy to carry around with me that would give me all the basic knowledge that I need in terms of that module. Also, if it was, for example, when I went to the formulation module, the part 1, as soon as I came back to site, I decided to go and spend some time in production, watching setups, manufacturing process. I spent time talking to some of the engineers on site to understand what do they do on a day-to-day basis, but at the same time, what changes within equipment could impact and what impacts that could have to the product, and whether they had that in their forefront. Some more theoretical modules, I would come back to work and perform a gap analysis, between what I've learned in that module and what we are doing on a day-to-day basis. And from that, I updated a few procedures, made sure things were improved within the site. But that was the best way I found to actually apply my knowledge straight away so that that would stay in my head. And I would then look through the study guide, and if I needed to go on a visit or something, I would try and arrange for around that time as well to make sure I was consolidating those modules like almost straight away in my mind. And as part of that, I think I did the formulation part 1 first, then I did the part 2, and then I went on the API course after. And what I've done is I managed to pick a product on our site where an API audit was arranged for. I watched that product being manufactured just before the audit from start to end, went on the audit to understand the raw material and how the process around making that raw material. And then when I came back, I went to watch a packaging of the same product. So it was really nice to be able to follow through one product in practical terms. So I did things like that just to try and consolidate my learnings.
I think what you're saying is you're visualizing the theory in application
Yes.
terms. That you've learned some theoretical information during the course. Yes, we've done lots of great case studies and we've tried as tutors to make it as realistic as possible. But then you really have to do it. And learning it versus doing it are two completely different things. And that doing it will really translate into your application form in a much more credible way than I attended the MedChem course. I learned a lot about biology and pharmacology. It was interesting. Well, no, we had a product complaint. We had an adverse reaction potential signal. We had this deviation where the impurity spike was above the required threshold. Therefore, pharmacologically, that means to me, and we were able to do this, this, and this. And I think that's that ability to articulate it in a real world. It comes back to what I said before, is that competency assessment model. Your past behavior will predict your future behavior. And that's what a QP assessor is trying to evaluate. Have you done this before? And will you do the same again in the future or not? I want to close off our discussion by looking at the viva, to work backwards and to reflect on what you would have done differently, if anything. Did the application form help you in your viva? What did you miss, or what did you absolutely nail in your training or your application form that made a difference in your viva?
Okay. One of the things I would change, I think I would have been a lot more thorough in my application completion throughout the modules. Although I was going through the study guide and I was making points of gaps, I didn't actually fill in my application in detail as I finished each module. And for me, at the end, having to put all that in, although I had notes in different pieces of paper, it wasn't very structured. And that was very challenging then to get the application finalized.
Is that because you just forgot what you'd done 2 years previously, or is there something else that you'd missed?
You forget some of the details, although I had it all written down, but just in notebooks, so I could go back, read my notes. But I wish I had actually proper filled in as I was doing the activities, because I think it would have come across a lot more realistic. I wish I had written my application in a more structured way as I was going through the issues, because I think that would have come across to the assessors as more of a live experience taking place, if you know what I'm saying. Throughout the process, I received my application back for amendments in 2 sections. And in the email I received back from the Royal Society of Chemistry, it said, the assessors believe you have this experience, but you were not able to demonstrate that well. And they wanted details such as, if you went for a visit, how many days were you in that visit? So how many hours have you spent doing this activity? Although it was very minor because it was only 2 sections within the whole application form, I think if I had done a few those as I went through investigating a deviation, or as I went through a visit, or as I spent time in the micro lab, for example, as I went to a tour of the purified water system in my site, if I had written there and then, it would have come across I think, better for the assessors. So I think that would be one of the things I would definitely change. What I think went well, though, was the fact that I had a lot of practice. So I made sure I asked my colleague, asked my sponsor. I also asked experienced QPs that I knew that work within my organization. My boss put me in contact with another experienced QP as well to have that practice. And I think that on the day, I think the assessors were quite confident that I had that experience in terms that my answers were structured and I could quickly go through issues and ask the right questions back, etc. So I think that's definitely one thing I've done right. But in terms of my application, I would change the completion of it. So I would have completed it in more of the day to day instead of leaving the details for the end.
I think that would also help in building your maturity of the application form process, because you start the first module, you write it down, then you go to the second module. You've learned from the module, you've learned from the second module when you do module 3, etc. And it builds up that maturity and that reflection so that your story is consistent as well. I really like that reflection, and I think that will certainly benefit those listening in to start writing up the review the minute you finish that learning intervention.
And I would say not just review, but actually have the application form template and then fill it in. Because although I was doing those gap analysis, because I didn't follow the template, I didn't follow the structure, I think that's where I failed a little bit.
Excellent feedback. So are you now named on a license?
The variation is going through. So, because I passed a month and 3 days ago, the variation has been submitted.
I think that was my biggest emotional moment. I signed my first batch certification and I got a round of applause in the office when I did that. So I'm sure you're looking forward to that first round of applause when you get that approval.
Yes, yes, for sure. I think that's when the pin will drop and I'm going to be like, now it's real.
That's very true. Be careful what you ask for. You might just get it, as they say. But what an honourable role on behalf of the patient. I bet you can't wait.
Yes, yes, I can't wait.
Fantastic. Rebecca, it's been a really interesting journey today to listen to your reflections on your QP journey. Thank you so much. I'm sure that those listening in will greatly benefit from your own personal experience, which I think is that tenacity to own it yourself, to really drive it yourself, to really hold down those who are helping you to task, to not be afraid to send the email, can you help me? Can I come and visit? Can I do this? And I think overall, what's jumped out to me is wanting to live the QP role for your application form for your viva. I think that's really jumped out.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the chat.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Good luck in your QP career. It's going to be a fantastic career moving forward, I'm absolutely sure.
Thank you. Thank you.